Welcome everyone to Keep It Classy Tech, and in this video I want to talk about why some people will say that OLED TVs or maybe even just HDR or Dolby Vision looks too dim. Also, to distinguish the differences in what brightness means when people talk about a TV being brighter or not being brighter.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
Alright, here's a scene I paused on Our Planet. This is in Dolby Vision, and it's fairly white, a lot of snow, and even still, it's only measuring at 83 nits. Now why is that? Well, because HDR and Dolby Vision, most of the scene that you're seeing falls in that SDR space range. It's only in specific, very bright highlights. Let me bring up the pointer. So like if you were to look over in this section, it's going to pull up the menu, but those little bright dots right there. So if I get rid of the pointer, those little bright dots underneath where it shows the picture mode, like that, I'm sure if I could measure something that small, is going to be brighter. Those are HDR highlights. So with HDR, you have still your main scene that falls in that SDR range, and then you have your highlights, which are brighter.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying? Oh my god, stop fucking lying.
But just because your TV is capable of 700, 800, 1000, 1500, whatever nits at a 10% window in a synthetic setting, you're never going to get that in a real content scenario.
What? I'm out, man.
Alright, now this is HDR, and it's a bright outdoorsy scene from the Grand Tour on Amazon. So right now it's in cinema mode. Let me just double check what settings are turned on here. So tone mapping is off. And then if I go to cinema home, I'm going to turn tone mapping on, and then they should be the same other than the tone mapping. So here, cinema home with the tone mapping on. It's measuring 270 nits on the roof of that car. This is a very bright image that I'm looking at right now. The average picture level is very bright, but yet we're still only measuring 270 nits. So when people use the word brightness, my question is, what do you mean? Do you mean the overall brightness of the entire image like this, being very, very bright, being overly bright, brighter than it's supposed to be? Do you mean what the max brightness the TV is capable of in a measurement? And there's a very long discussion to be had about measurements, why they are almost useless, and at least until a better standard can be created of how to actually measure brightness.
Oh!
But maybe we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this. So again, here if I go to cinema mode, this is how it was shot, this is how it looked, this is what the creator was seeing when they shot this. This is how it should look.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying? Oh my god, stop fucking lying.
See, this is what I'm talking about. People making up stuff. So you telling me 270 nit highlight is HDR? That's not even HDR, my G. And I don't know how you conjuring this stuff up, man. You're only measuring what your OLED is capable of. But that's not what the creators intended that to look like. The HDR is supposed to make things look more real life. Like when I walk outside and I look outside and it's bright, you know, that scene you showed, they was actually outside with real sunlight. And it was much brighter than your OLED is showing. HDR, the high dynamic range, the brightness is what makes it look real. So what I'm trying to figure out, you know, when you talk about creators' intent, you know, that's what it was supposed to look like. I mean, do you work at Paramount Pictures? I mean, you work for Netflix, you know the directors. I mean, you speak about it like you know for a fact that that's what the director's intent is. That's the creator's intent. I mean, you work for Sony Pictures? I don't think so. But when it comes to HDR, there is an actual basis of a standard. All right? I went over this in another video, but I'm going to go over it briefly again for those of y'all that are new here. Because according to the UHD Alliance, right? The UHD Alliance, right? In April 2016, the UHD Alliance, an industry group made up of companies like Samsung, LG, who makes your TV, right? Sony, Panasonic, Dolby, and many others, announced the Ultra HD Premium certification for UHD Blu-ray players. This benchmark set some baseline goals for HDR, such as the ability to display up to 1,000 nits of peak brightness and a minimum of 10-bit color depth. So you're telling me your 270 nit highlight is HDR, when a baseline goal for HDR is the ability to display up to 1,000 nits. The best HDR TV models will not only meet these standards, but exceed them. With support for more than one major HDR technology, as technology moves forward, we're seeing TVs exceed those initial standards by leaps and bounds. Right? Right? Standard dynamic range TVs generally produce 300 to 500 nits, but in general, HDR TVs aim much higher. Some top tier models can display upwards of 2,000 nits of peak brightness for HDR highlights. This is the UHD Alliance by the industry, the people who actually make the movies. So how you figure 270 nits, that's what the creator intended. Why do y'all just make shit up? I mean, I understand, bro. You gotta, you love OLED, but you can't make that OLED fit everything, bro. OLEDs are cool, man, but you can't be going around talking about this is what the creator intended. How you know that? There's a lot of information out here on HDR, man, and OLED TVs cannot properly display HDR. It's a known thing. So why are you guys out here just making up stuff?
Stop it. Get some help.
Is it your OLED bias? You know, HD TV Test, he actually had a series of videos, right, where he was showing 4K Blu-rays that actually display real HDR, right? Real HDR. I'm a cinephile, videophile, audiophile, man. I got roughly over 100 4K Blu-rays, man. And they have this certification on the disc, right? The Ultra HD Premium certification. It's on the disc. So that means that there is a standard. All right, guys, let me get this in focus. So I just grabbed a few of these off of my shelf. I am a collector. Some of these I haven't even opened, like this Matrix trilogy right here, but this is what I do, guys. But when I'm shopping for 4K Blu-rays, let's get this in focus. All right, that's what I'm looking for right there. Now, they're not on everything, but I know if it has this certification, there's at least 1,000 nits of brightness coming off of this disc. All right, that's just the Matrix. We're gonna go with the Game of Thrones. Let's see. All right, you can see it right there on the corner, guys. If I can get this in focus with this camera. Either way, you guys can see what it is. All right, it's right there on the corner. There's the logo, guys. Mad Max. Same deal. All right, same deal. Greatest Showman. Right there. All right. There is a standard, my G. You think they're just certifying these movies? They're just certifying them. They're just stamping this on here for no reason. That is not what they're doing, my guy. See that right there? Ultra HD Premium. I mean, I can just go on and on with the movies. This is the Transformers collection right here. It's there, guys. Straight up. We're not playing any games with this, man. So it just gets me tight, man, when people just be on here just making up stuff, man. All right? Ultra HD Premium. It's the Hulk. Let's get into it. Ultra HD Premium. All right? The Bond movies. The Bond movies. All right, let's get into it. Y'all get the point, man. Y'all definitely get the point. It is on here, guys. Right there. And the baseline goal for HDR, just on a baseline, at least 1,000 nits of peak brightness and a minimum of 10-bit color.
Hello everyone, Vincent here from HDTV Test here. Today, we are going to analyze the 4K Blu-ray of Rogue One, a Star Wars story. So let's start off with the beginning, and in the opening scene you can see here that when the spaceship is actually traveling across the ocean, the sun and also the reflections of the wave hit or even exceeded 1000 nits. It is an extremely good start in terms of the peak brightness and the HDR presentation on the part of Rogue One. And next we go into the sequence where a very young Jean is running into her home to warn her parents, and here you can see that various lights in the house is lit in a very impressive, very impactful brightness, exceeding 1000 nits and even occasionally reaching 1200 nits, 1400 nits. And next we go to another scene where I specifically wanted to check how bright the sun gets, and as the spacecraft flew past, you can see that the sun here exceeded 1000 nits. And then in the next sequence, we can see in the city of Jeddah the reflections of the buildings and also the spacecrafts exceeded 1000 nits quite easily, giving that sort of sparkle, that sort of pristine three-dimensional depth and pop to the entire presentation. And then we go into the next scene where Death Star is in action. So when the Death Star laser is being fired and the explosions ensued, we can again see it easily exceeding 1000 nits. And then in the final sequence where these characters are waiting for the expanding explosion to reach them again from Death Star firing, you can see that the expanding explosion reached about 1200 nits, again full screen, so it looked extremely impressive on the Canon DPV 3120, which is capable of 2000 nits full screen, and probably less so on most OLEDs, because most OLEDs generally have full screen brightness that is capped to around 150 nits because of ABL or automatic brightness limiter.
But just because your TV is capable of 700, 800, 1000, 1500, whatever nits at a 10% window in a synthetic setting, you're never going to get that in a real content scenario.
Hello everyone, Vincent from HDTV Test here. In this video, we're going to analyze the 4K Blu-ray of Wonder Woman in terms of the HDR presentation. The HDR is really cranked up a notch. It is as if the colorist just said, sort it, I'm just going to go to town here. I'm going to turn it up to 11. And you can see here that the fire surrounding the villain here, they reached around 1700 nits and even above 2000 nits. And then in another shot here, it is very, very brief that there are some elements that actually exceeded 3000 nits. And in the final act here, you can see that the lightning reached around 1200 nits. And certainly the whole HDR presentation in the final act is extremely impressive. It actually even exceeded any capabilities of any OLED TVs in terms of the average picture level, because OLED is only capable of 150 nits full fill because of ABL or automatic brightness limiter. But you can see that this scene here, with all the fire around, it consistently exceeded 1000 nits. So this sequence here would look best on a high nit full array local dimming LED LCD television.
But just because your TV is capable of 700, 800, 1000, 1500, whatever nits at a 10% window in a synthetic setting, you're never going to get that in a real content scenario.
In this video, we're going to analyze the 4K Blu-ray of the Matrix in terms of the HDR presentation. So let's go into the HDR analysis toolkit of the Canon DPV-3120 then. And right from the start of this movie, you can see many elements on screen that reached almost 1000 nits or even exceeded 1000 nits, such as the flashlights from these officers here. And by flashlights, I mean the torch, not the sex toy. And then if we go into this sequence here where Neo is first introduced to the construct, you can see that the white background hovered almost around 800 nits consistently. And I think, from memory, only a few displays have the capability to do this scene justice. I'm talking about full array local dimming LED LCDs, which have really high nits full screen. And then if we go into the next scene in the Nebuchadnezzar, you can see these lamps, these fluorescent lights here behind tank exceeding 1000 nits, reaching maybe 1200 nits, and even during brief flashes of scene cuts, reaching 1400 nits, giving that sort of dynamic range to the whole image. And even in fairly mundane scenes, such as this one, when Neo met the Oracle, you can see the handlebar on the oven reached 400 nits, almost 400 nits, giving that sort of dimensionality that, more subdued HDR presentation just cannot deliver. When I talk about subdued HDR presentation, they are basically grading the sun at 200 nits, and when you have only a dynamic range from 0 to 200 nits to encapsulate everything from black to the sun, then you don't have much dimensionality or depth to actually play with in terms of the lighting. Of course, cinematographers and DPs and directors have other means to introduce depth to the picture. For example, by using their lens aperture, by using bokeh, by using focus, by using placement, by using the wide angle or, close up of the shot itself. But light is just another element that I think can add a lot of dimension, a lot of texture to the entire image. And certainly the Matrix does it in spades here. In this video, we're going to analyze the 4K Blu-ray of Blade Runner 2049. Blade Runner 2049 is essentially an SDR movie in an HDR container in a nutshell. So if you look at these scenes here, even with the sun shining through the leaves, you don't get a peak brightness more than 200 nits. And in this scene where there is bright holographic lights throughout the city, again, the maximum peak brightness does not exceed 200 nits at all. And I think the highest peak brightness that I've recorded from this movie is during the opening Sony Columbia logos, where the peak brightness or max CLL briefly jumped to 330 nits, and then in a later shot it reached 330 nits very briefly. But the vast majority of the movie is below 200 nits in terms of the peak brightness. So because I have two LG 48-inch C10 or CX OLED TV here, so I thought I would do an experiment and put the 4K Blu-ray disc on one LG C10 fed through an Oppo 203 player, playing it in 4K HDR obviously, and the other LG CX I'm playing through another Oppo 203 displaying the SDR Blu-ray. And as you can see, shot for shot, they look visually similar between the HDR and SDR. So essentially, this film is an SDR movie in an HDR container. And here's the thing, when I discussed, let's say, The Mandalorian, which was below 300 nits, and let's say when I discussed the Star Wars movie, which I thought was upscale from SDR in terms of the waveform analysis, I think, I received a lot of criticism from some of you guys, and maybe even some colorists out there, who says that, I'm really not respecting the creator's intent, which I think, it's not fair, because, me, being a videophile, being someone who values color accuracy, values video fidelity, I'm all for creative intent. But I think, to put an SDR movie in an HDR container and to try to sell it as HDR is a bit misleading. The studios or the DPs or the directors, if they are so anti-HDR, and Roger Deakins, who was the DP for Blade Runner 2049, is famously against HDR. He doesn't like HDR, so you can understand the SDR-like grade. But I think, if you want to maintain creative intent, you can easily put out some content, maybe through streaming or whatever, label it as SDR rather than, force it as HDR. Obviously, they can charge more money, and maybe that's the whole point, but I think it is a bit misleading.
Alright, here's a scene I paused on our planet. This is in Dolby Vision, and it's fairly white, a lot of snow. And even still, it's only measuring at 83 nits. Alright, now this is HDR, and it's a bright outdoorsy scene from the Grand Tour on Amazon. So here, it's in my home with the tone mapping on. It's measuring 270 nits on the roof of that car.